Patmos. The year is 95 AD. The Aegean Sea stretches endlessly around a small volcanic island, its waters boiling under the Mediterranean sun like melted bronze. The island is barren, isolated, a place of exile and punishment. Here, far from the great cities of the Roman Empire, far from Jerusalem and Rome, a prisoner lives in a cave carved into the rocky hillside. His name is John, though history will remember him as John of Patmos, John the Revelator, the author of the most terrifying text ever written. Inside the cave, the air is thick with salt and limestone dust. By the flickering light of an oil lamp, John writes. His hand moves across parchment, the stylus scratching out words in Greek koine, the common language of the Eastern Mediterranean. He is not writing a letter or a history. He is writing something else entirely, a vision, an apocalypse, a coded message of resistance wrapped in cosmic symbolism and prophetic fury. The words he writes will echo through 2 millennia. They will be copied by monks, debated by theologians, feared by peasants, weaponized by reformers, and analyzed by scientists. They will inspire art and terror, faith and paranoia, beauty and violence. And at the center of this text, buried in the 13th chapter of his Revelation, John will write a single cryptic instruction that will haunt humanity forever. Here is wisdom. Let him that hath understanding count the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. 3 digits, 1 symbol, an invitation to decode that has never been answered to everyone's satisfaction. For 2,000 years, this number has been branded on enemies, on emperors, on machines, and on the human imagination itself. It has been the code of evil, the mark of the damned, the signature of the Antichrist. But the truth, buried beneath layers of mistranslation, political agenda, medieval superstition, and mathematical obsession, is stranger and more human than the legend. This is the real story of 666. How one symbol of resistance became the world's most feared number, and how that fear reveals more about humanity than any prophecy ever could. And to understand the number, we must first understand the man who wrote it, and the world that forced him to write in code. John of Patmos was not writing for future generations. He was not writing for us. He was writing for a specific audience living under specific circumstances in the late 1st century. Christians in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, who were facing the full weight of Roman imperial persecution. The emperor was Domitian, who ruled from 81 to 96 AD. Domitian demanded to be worshipped as a yid. He required his subjects to address him as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. Throughout the provinces, citizens were expected to participate in the imperial cult, to burn incense before statues of the emperor, to acknowledge his divinity. For most people in the Roman world, this was simply civic duty, a routine gesture of loyalty, no more significant than saluting a flag. But for Christians, it was impossible. Their faith was built on monotheism, on the radical claim that there was only one God, and that his kingdom stood in opposition to all earthly powers, including Rome. To worship Caesar was to betray Christ. To refuse was to invite death. The persecution was systematic and devastating. Christians who refused to participate in the imperial cult were excluded from trade guilds, barred from markets, arrested, tortured and executed. Their properties were confiscated. Their names were erased from public records. They became non-persons in the eyes of the state, invisible and vulnerable. The mechanics of persecution were insidious. In many cities, participation in trade guilds required ritual acknowledgement of the guild's patron deity and the emperor's divine status. A Christian craftsman, a tent maker, a potter, a metal worker would face an impossible choice: participate in the ritual and deny Christ, or refuse and lose the ability to work legally. Without guild membership, they could not sell their goods in official markets, could not bid on contracts, could not train apprentices. Economic exclusion was often as effective as physical persecution. Moreover, any Roman citizen could denounce a suspected Christian to local authorities. The accusations might be motivated by genuine religious conviction, but often they were driven by personal grudges, business rivalries, or simply the desire to confiscate a neighbour's property. Once accused, a Christian would be brought before a magistrate and required to demonstrate loyalty by offering sacrifice to the emperor's image. Refusal meant imprisonment, torture, or execution. Some recanted under pressure, others held firm and became martyrs. John himself was a victim of this persecution. Tradition holds that he was exiled to Patmos for the word of God and the testimony of Jesus Christ, in other words, for refusing to renounce his faith. The island of Patmos was used as a penal colony, a place where Rome sent political prisoners, criminals, and troublemakers to work in the stone quarries that supplied building materials for the empire. The conditions were harsh. Prisoners lived in caves or rough shelters. They worked long hours breaking and hauling stone. Food was minimal. Medical care was non-existent. Many died from disease, malnutrition, or accidents. The island was a place to break people, to make them disappear, to erase them from history. But John did not break. Instead, on that isolated island, cut off from his community, watching Roman ships patrol the horizon, John did what prophets have always done. He wrote. He wrote to encourage, to warn, to promise that justice would come, that the oppressors would fall, that faithfulness would be vindicated. But he could not write plainly. If his message had been intercepted by Roman authorities, if it had openly called for resistance or named the emperor as an enemy, it would have meant death. Not just for John, but for every Christian community that possessed a copy. Letters to and from political prisoners were monitored. Any text found to contain seditious material would be destroyed and its recipients punished. So John wrote in code. He used a literary form that would be familiar to his readers but opaque to outsiders. Apocalyptic literature. His revelation belongs to a specific literary genre that was widespread in ancient Judaism and early Christianity, especially during times of persecution and political crisis. The word apocalypse comes from the Greek apocalypsis, meaning unveiling or revelation, the disclosure of hidden truth, usually through visionary experience. Apocalyptic literature had specific characteristics. It featured elaborate symbolic imagery, beasts representing kingdoms, horns representing kings, numbers encoding meanings, cosmic battles symbolizing earthly conflicts. It claimed to reveal the underlying spiritual reality behind visible events. It promised that current suffering was temporary and that divine justice would ultimately triumph. It offered hope to the powerless by asserting that the powerful were doomed. Most importantly for our purposes, apocalyptic literature was deliberately coded. It used symbols that would be transparent to insiders, people familiar with Jewish prophetic tradition and current political circumstances, but opaque to outsiders, particularly to the authorities who might intercept and examine such texts. This genre had precedents. The Book of Daniel, written during the persecution of Jews under the Seleucid King Antiochus IV Epiphanes in the 2nd century BC, used similar techniques. It described empires as beasts, kings as horns, and encoded the name of Antiochus in cryptic references. Jewish readers would have recognized the allusions, Greek-speaking authorities might not. John's revelation follows this pattern and extends it. His text is saturated with symbolic language drawn from Hebrew scripture. The beast that rises from the sea, the dragon with 7 heads, the woman clothed with the sun, the 4 horsemen, the lamb with 7 horns and 7 eyes. These are not literal creatures, but encrypted references to political powers, historical events, and theological truths. The 7 churches addressed at the beginning of Revelation were real communities in Asia Minor: Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. These were major cities in the Roman province of Asia, connected by a circular road system. A messenger carrying John's letter could travel from church to church, delivering copies and explanations. The specific encouragements and criticisms addressed to each church show that John knew their circumstances intimately. To ancient readers familiar with Jewish prophetic tradition and aware of current political pressures, the codes would have been relatively transparent when John wrote about a beast with 7 heads. The heads. They would have understood this as Rome, which was famously built on 7 hills. When he wrote about the beast receiving worship, they would have recognized the imperial cult. When he wrote about economic exclusion, no one able to buy or sell without the beast's mark, they would have seen their own predicament reflected. But to Roman authorities, the texts would have seemed like mystical gibberish, the ravings of a religious fanatic with no political significance. This was the genius of apocalyptic coding. It allowed resistance to be expressed and communities to be encouraged while maintaining plausible deniability. And at the heart of this coded text, John placed a number 66. This number would become the most famous, most feared, and most misunderstood element of his entire revelation. To understand why John used a number to identify his enemy, we must understand how ancient people thought about numbers. In the ancient world, numbers were not just mathematical tools, they were symbols, carriers of meaning, windows into cosmic truth. The ancient worldview was fundamentally different from our modern one. We tend to see numbers as arbitrary human conventions, useful for counting and measuring, but not intrinsically meaningful. We might note numerical coincidences, a friend's birthday matching ours, patterns in sequences, but we typically dismiss these as chance. Ancient people saw numbers differently. They believed the universe was structured according to mathematical principles, that numbers reflected divine order, and that understanding numbers was a way of understanding reality itself. This was not superstition, but philosophy, rooted in traditions going back to Pythagoras and beyond. Pythagoras, the Greek philosopher and mathematician who lived in the 6th century BC, taught that all is number. He believed that numerical relationships governed everything from musical harmony to planetary motion to ethical principles. His followers developed elaborate theories about which numbers were masculine or feminine, perfect or imperfect, divine or earthly. These ideas influenced Greek philosophy for centuries. Jewish tradition had its own numerical mysticism, rooted in the structure of Hebrew language and scripture. The Hebrew Bible was full of significant numbers: 7 days of creation, 12 tribes of Israel, 40 years into the wilderness, 70 years of exile. Interpreters looked for patterns, for mathematical relationships that might reveal hidden meanings. In Hebrew and Greek, the 2 primary languages of Jewish and early Christian scripture, there were no separate symbols for numbers. Instead, letters of the alphabet doubled as numerals. This was not unusual. Many ancient writing systems worked this way. But it had a profound consequence. Every word had a numerical value, the sum of its letters. In Hebrew, the alphabet has 22 letters, each with a numerical value. Aleph, A, L1, Bet, B, E2, or Gimel, G, 3, and so on through Tav, T, 400. Some letters had extended values. Final hobbled forms of certain letters used at the end of words had higher values. This allowed the system to represent numbers up to 1,000 and beyond. In Greek, the system was similar. Alpha, A, equals 1, beta, Bandi 2, Gamma, gamma, Hegi to 3, through omega, O, 800. The Greek system also included 3 archaic letters no longer used in regular writing, but retained for numerical purposes: digamma, W, equals 6, copper, Q, equals 90, and sampi, SB, equals 900. This meant that every word, every name, every phrase could be calculated as a number. This practice was called gematria in Hebrew tradition and isopsephy in Greek tradition. It was used for various purposes: finding hidden connections between words, discovering deeper meanings in texts, creating puzzles and codes, and even for playful word games. Archaeological evidence confirms the widespread use of gematria and isopsephy throughout the ancient Mediterranean world. Graffiti in Pompeii, the Roman city buried by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD, includes numerous examples. One famous piece of graffiti reads, "I love her whose number is 555, a declaration of love with the beloved's name encoded numerically, perhaps to keep the identity secret from rivals or disapproving family members." Another Pompeii inscription calculates the numerical value of the Emperor Nero's name and makes a joke about it. These were not obscure scholarly practices, but part of popular culture. Educated people throughout the Mediterranean world would have been familiar with the technique. In Jewish tradition, gematria was used as a method of scriptural interpretation. Rabbis would note when two words or phrases had the same numerical value and explore the theological connections between them. For example, the Hebrew words for love, ahava, achshbieki, and one, iker, heikisht, both equal 13. This was interpreted as revealing a deep connection between love and divine unity. The practice was considered a legitimate form of hermeneutics, not the primary method of interpretation, but a supplementary tool for discovering layers of meaning in sacred texts. It was based on the belief that scripture was divinely inspired down to the letter, that every detail was intentional, and that numerical patterns could reveal aspects of divine truth. This numerical worldview was not limited to Jews and Christians. Greek philosophers explored mathematical patterns in nature. The Neoplatonists developed elaborate theories about the emanation of reality from divine unity through mathematical principles. Gnostic sects used numerical symbolism extensively in their cosmologies and rituals. The Roman world, while less philosophically inclined toward numerical mysticism than the Greek, still participated in these practices. Roman augurs interpreted numbers in omens. Astrologers calculated numerical relationships between planets to predict events. Even practical Roman engineers and architects used mathematical ratios considered not just functional but cosmically significant. In this cultural context, John's instruction to count the number of the beast would have been immediately understood. He was not inventing a new practice, but using a standard technique. He was inviting his readers to perform gematria or isopsephy to calculate the numerical value of a name. The phrase "here is wisdom" signals that this requires knowledge and discernment. It's not a random number, but a calculated one. The phrase "let him that hath understanding count" indicates that the puzzle is solvable by those with the right knowledge. Likely knowledge of Hebrew gematria, familiarity with recent history, and awareness of current political circumstances. The phrase, "it is the number of a man," confirms that this is not a cosmic constant or a mystical formula, but a specific person's name encoded as a number. John is not describing abstract evil, but pointing to a concrete individual who embodies that evil. This was the standard way apocalyptic authors communicated dangerous information, through numerical codes that insiders could decode, but outsiders would miss, and John's readers, if they had the right knowledge, could solve his puzzle. The overwhelming consensus among modern biblical scholars and historians is that the beast is Nero Caesar, the Roman emperor who ruled from 54 to 68 AD. Nero was the fifth emperor of Rome, coming to power at age 16 after his mother Agrippina maneuvered to have her husband, Emperor Claudius, adopt Nero and name him heir. The early years of Nero's reign were relatively stable, guided by competent advisors including the philosopher Seneca. But as Nero matured, he became increasingly erratic, paranoid, and cruel. Nero murdered his mother Agrippina in 59 AD, having her stabbed to death after a failed attempt to drown her. He murdered his wife Octavia to marry his mistress Poppaea. He murdered his stepbrother Britannicus, Claudius's natural son who had a legitimate claim to the throne. He executed senators and commanders on suspicion of disloyalty. His reign became a byword for tyranny and madness. But it was the events of 64 AD that would make Nero's name infamous among Christians forever. In July of that year, a massive fire broke out in Rome. It burned for 6 days, destroying much of the city. 10 of Rome's 14 districts were damaged, 3 were completely destroyed. Thousands were left homeless. The loss of property and life was catastrophic. Rumours immediately spread that Nero himself had ordered the fire, either because he wanted to clear space for a massive new palace complex, or simply because he wanted to see Rome burn while he recited poetry about the fall of Troy. The historian Suetonius, writing decades later, recorded this rumour, though he couldn't confirm it. Another historian, Tacitus, was more sceptical, suggesting the fire was accidental. What is certain is what happened next. Nero needed a scapegoat to deflect blame from himself. He chose the Christians, a small, foreign, unpopular sect that most Romans viewed with suspicion and hostility. Tacitus, no friend to Christians, described what followed in his annals. To suppress this rumour, Nero fabricated scapegoats and punished with every refinement the notoriously depraved Christians, as they were popularly called. Their originator, Christ, had been executed in Tiberius' reign by the governor of Judea, Pontius Pilatus. But in spite of this temporary setback, the deadly superstition had broken out afresh, not only in Judea, where the mischief had started, but even in Rome. All degraded and shameful practices collect and flourish in the capital. First, Nero had self-acknowledged Christians arrested. Then, on their information, large numbers of others were condemned, not so much for incendiarism as for their antisocial tendencies. Their deaths were made farcical. Dressed in wild animals' skins, they were torn to pieces by dogs or crucified, or made into torches to be ignited after dark as substitutes for daylight. Nero provided his gardens for the spectacle, and exhibited displays in the circus, at which he mingled with the crowd or stood in a chariot, dressed as charioteer. This was not mere political repression. This was theatrical cruelty, designed to entertain the Roman populace while eliminating a scapegoat population. Christians were hunted, arrested, tortured for information about others, then executed in ways designed to maximize suffering and spectacle. The trauma of this persecution burned itself into early Christian memory. The Apostle Peter was traditionally believed to have been martyred in Rome during this persecution, crucified upside down at his own request, feeling unworthy to die in the same manner as Christ. Paul was also believed to have been executed in Rome around this time, beheaded as basing his Roman citizenship. Even though Nero died in 68 AD, nearly 3 decades before John wrote Revelation, his name remained synonymous with evil in Christian consciousness. He was the archetype of the persecutor, the first emperor to specifically target Christians, the one who had turned Rome's power against them most viciously. The circumstances of Nero's death added to his legendary status. By 68 AD, Nero had lost the support of the military and the Senate. Multiple governors and generals declared themselves emperor, plunging Rome into civil war. With enemies closing in on Rome, Nero fled the city and committed suicide. His last words, according to Suetonius, were "Qualis artifex poreo." What an artist dies in me! Even in death, his narcissism was absolute. But his death was also mysterious and abrupt. He was only 30 years old, still in the prime of life. There was no body to display, no public funeral to confirm his death. This created space for speculation, doubt, and myth. Within years of his reported death, rumours began circulating that Nero had not really died. Some said he had fled east to Parthia, Rome's great enemy, and was gathering an army to reclaim his throne. Others said he had died but would return from the dead, resurrected by dark powers to resume his tyranny. This myth of Nero redivivus, Nero reborn, was widespread throughout the late 1st century. This was not just Christian fantasy. It was believed across the empire by people of all religions and backgrounds. The Roman historians Suetonius and Tacitus both mention the myth. The Roman historian Dio Chrysostom, writing around 100 AD, noted that many people refused to believe Nero was dead and that some thought he was still alive in hiding. Several false Neros appeared in the eastern provinces during the decades after 68 AD, claiming to be the restored emperor. Each gathered followings before being suppressed by the Roman authorities. The last significant false Nero appeared around 88 AD, during Domitian's reign, just a few years before John wrote Revelation. The power of this myth cannot be overstated. For people living in the late 1st century, the idea that Nero might return was not absurd speculation but a live possibility, discussed in rumours, feared by some, hoped for by others. The boundary between recent history and current threat was fluid. For Christians, the myth had special significance. Nero was the archetypal persecutor, the first emperor to target them specifically and systematically. If he were to return, it would mean the renewal of persecution, perhaps on an even greater scale. The Nero redivivus myth thus became intertwined with Christian apocalyptic expectation. The beast would return, the persecution would resume, but ultimately God would intervene and deliver the faithful. When John wrote about a beast that had received a mortal wound but had been healed, his original readers would have immediately thought of Nero. The description was unmistakable. One of its heads seemed to have received a death blow, but its mortal wound had been healed. In amazement, the whole earth followed the beast. Revelation 13:3. This was the Nero redivivus myth, encoded in apocalyptic symbolism. When John described the beast as having 7 heads, identified as 7 kings, of whom 5 have fallen, 1 is living, and the other has not yet come, Revelation 17:9-10, interpreters have traditionally seen this as referring to Roman emperors. If you count from Augustus, the first emperor, Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, 5 fallen, then Galba or Vespasian, 1 living, with more to come. The exact counting is debated, but the reference to a sequence of Roman rulers is clear. When John wrote about a beast demanding worship and killing those who refused, his readers would have recognized the imperial cult and the persecution they were currently experiencing under Domitian. But John went further than illusion and myth. He encoded Nero's name numerically, providing a puzzle that his readers could solve to confirm their interpretation, and to do so in a way that would not be obvious to Roman authorities who might intercept the pseudonym. In Greek, the language John wrote in, the name Nero Caesar is transliterated from Latin as Neron Caesar, Neron Caesar. If you calculate the numerical value of these letters using Greek is obsevi, so that nu n equals 50, epsilon e equals 5, rho r equals 100, omega wo equals 800, nu n equals 50, kappa k equals 20, alpha a equals 1, iota e equals 10, sigma is 200, alpha a 1, rho 100, total 50 plus 5 plus 100 plus 800 plus 50 plus 20 plus 1 plus 10 plus 200 plus 1 plus 100, 137. But there's a problem. That's not 666. So the Greek isopsiphy doesn't work directly. The solution lies in Hebrew. Although John wrote in Greek, he was deeply rooted in Jewish tradition and would have been fluent in Hebrew. Many of the Christians in Asia Minor to whom he was writing were themselves Jewish Christians or Gentiles who had learned from Jewish teachers and attended synagogues before converting. They would have been familiar with Hebrew gematria, or at least aware of it as a practice. In Hebrew, Nero Caesar is transliterated as Enarvin Keset, Neron Caesar. This is the standard way Latin names were rendered in Hebrew in the 1st century, preserving the n ending that was common in Greek transliterations, but that Latin sometimes dropped. Calculate the numerical value using Hebrew gematria. Nun n x 50 resh r il 200 fav the ils 6 nun final 50 Kuaf K 100 Samek S 60 Resh calculation works exactly. This is not coincidence. This is deliberate, careful encoding. John used the Hebrew transliteration of Nero's name to generate the number 66, creating a puzzle that his Jewish Christian readers could solve, or that any reader with knowledge of Hebrew gematria could solve, while keeping the message hidden from Roman authorities who would not think to use Hebrew calculations on a Greek text. The elegance of this encoding is remarkable. It operates on multiple levels simultaneously. First, it identifies a specific historical figure. Nero, the first great persecutor of Christians, the emperor whose name was synonymous with cruelty and tyranny. Second, it invokes the Nero redivivus myth, suggesting that the beast will return. The mortal wound that was healed refers both to Nero's death and rumoured survival, and to the pattern of persecution that seemed to die with Nero, but was revived under later emperors. Third, by using a code rather than naming Nero directly, it protects both John and his readers from charges of sedition. If the text were intercepted, John could claim he was simply recording mystical visions, not making political statements. The encoding provides plausible deniability. Fourth, it creates a sense of insider knowledge, binding the Christian communities together through shared understanding. Those who could solve the puzzle would know they were part of the informed group, that they understood what others missed. This strengthened community identity and cohesion. Fifth, it demonstrates that John himself is wise and divinely inspired. He can see through the surface of events to the underlying spiritual reality, and he can communicate this vision in ways that require discernment to understand. Sixth, and perhaps most importantly, it makes a theological claim that the apparently invincible power of Rome, embodied in its emperors, is not divine but human, not eternal but temporary, not worthy of worship but condemned by God. To reduce Nero Caesar to a number is to demystify imperial power, to show that it can be counted and calculated, measured and found wanting. The evidence for this interpretation is overwhelming. Not only does the gematria work perfectly, but it also makes sense in every dimension: historical, literary, theological and political. Nero was the right enemy at the right time, encoded in the right way for the right audience. But the interpretation is also strengthened by a consideration of Domitian, the emperor during John's exile. Ancient historians consistently compared Domitian to Nero. The historian Pliny the Younger called Domitian a second Nero in terms of cruelty. Juvenal, the satirist, made similar comparisons. The parallels were obvious to everyone living through Domitian's reign. Domitian demanded divine honours even more explicitly than Nero had. He insisted on being addressed as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. He required subjects throughout the empire to participate in his cult. He persecuted those who refused, including not just Christians but also Jews and Roman aristocrats suspected of disloyalty. By encoding Nero's name, John was simultaneously condemning both Nero, the first great persecutor, and Domitian, the current persecutor, the second Nero, while also prophetically warning of future emperors who would follow their pattern. The beast was not just one man, but a type, a recurring pattern of imperial tyranny and persecution that would continue until God's final judgment. Each manifestation of the beast bore the same mark: opposition to God, persecution of the faithful, demand for divine honours, use of state power to enforce religious conformity. The number 66 identified not just Nero but any emperor who embodied these characteristics. It was a code for recognising the beast in each new generation. This is why Revelation remained relevant and powerful even after Nero and Domitian were dead. The specific coded reference was to Nero, but the symbolic pattern applied to all who followed in his footsteps. The beast would keep returning, in different forms, under different names, until the final victory of God's kingdom. The number would keep marking those who opposed that kingdom. John's original readers would have understood all this. They lived in the immediate aftermath of Nero's persecution and in the midst of Domitian's. They knew the history. They feared the present. They hoped for divine intervention. And when they read John's instruction to count the number of the beast, When they performed the calculation and discovered it equaled Nero Caesar, they would have experienced recognition, validation, and hope. The message was clear. We know who the enemy is, we can name him. And because we can name him, because we can reduce him to a number, we know he is not a god. He is a man, and like all mortal men, his power will end. But there's a complication to this story, one that deepens our understanding of how ancient texts were transmitted and how the number 666 evolved. Not all ancient manuscripts of Revelation contain the number 666. Some contain 616 instead. The earliest surviving fragment of Revelation to contain the number of the beast is Papyrus 115, also known as P115, which dates to the 3rd or early 4th century, roughly 200 to 300 years after John wrote the original text. This fragment was part of a larger codex discovered in Egypt, probably in the area of Oxyrhynchus, one of the richest archaeological sites for ancient papyri. When scholars studied it in detail in the late 20th century, they found that it clearly reads Geist, Xi Stigma il 616, not Text, Xi Stigma il 66. This discovery was significant because P115 is older than most surviving manuscripts of Revelation. The majority of Greek New Testament manuscripts date from the 9th century or later, more than 800 years after the original texts were written. Earlier manuscripts are rare and precious. P115, dating from the 3rd or 4th century, is separated from John's original by only about 200 or 300 years, making it a relatively close witness to the original text. The existence of the 616 variant was not news to scholars. Irenaeus, a church father writing around 180 AD, less than a century after John wrote Revelation, mentions that some copies in his time contained 616. In his work Against Heresies, Irenaeus addresses the issue directly. This number is found in all the most approved and ancient copies, and those men who saw John face to face bear their testimony to it. I do not know how it is that some have erred following the ordinary mode of speech, and have vitiated the middle number in the name, deducting the amount of 50 from it, so that instead of 6 decades they will have it that there is but one. This passage is fascinating for several reasons. First, it confirms that by 180 AD, less than a century after John's death, there were already variant readings of the number. Second, it shows that some manuscripts were considered more authoritative than others, the most approved and ancient copies. Third, it indicates that some people claim direct connection to John himself, those men who saw John face to face, and that these witnesses supported 666. Fourth, it suggests that the 616 variant was not a random scribal error, but a systematic alteration, following the ordinary mode of speech, which implies a linguistic or translational issue. The phrase about vitiated the middle number is intriguing. In Greek numerals, 666 is written Aixest, Chi, 600, plus Sei, 60, plus Stigma, 6. And 619 is written Hiest, Chi, 600, plus Iota, 10, plus Stigma, under 6. The difference is in the middle character, Chi here 60, plus Cis Iota, 10, a difference of phi. Irenaeus notes this precisely, deducting the amount of 50 from it. Why do some manuscripts have 616 instead of 666? The answer lies again in the encoding of Nero's name and how that name was transliterated in different linguistic contexts. In Hebrew, as we've seen, Neron Caesar, Nervnksr, adds up to 6x, but in Latin, Nero's name was often written simply as Nero without the final N. This is because Latin names inflect differently than Greek names. In Greek, names borrowed from Latin often added an endings, match Greek declension patterns, but in Latin itself the name was Nero Caesar, without the additional N. If you calculate the Hebrew gematria of Nero Caesar, NRVKSR, instead of Neron Caesar, NRVNKSR, you lose one nun, n, which has a value of 50. Nun, n, il, 50. Resh, r, il, 200. Vav, v, ik, 6. Quof, k, equal 100. Samek, s, il, some 60. Reshas, il, 200. Total, 50. 200. 6. It's 100 plus 60. This was 200 equals 616. This reveals something fascinating about the transmission of John's text. Different Christian communities, working in different linguistic contexts and using different conventions for transliterating Roman names, generated different numerical values for Nero Caesar. Communities with strong connections to Hebrew and Jewish Christianity, particularly in the Eastern Empire where Greek was spoken and where Hebrew was more likely to be known, used Neron with the N and arrived at 666. Communities in the Western Empire, particularly those more influenced by the Latin and further from Jewish roots, used Nero without the final N and arrived at 616. Both numbers encode the same name. Both point to the same enemy. The variation is not a contradiction, but evidence of the text's original purpose. This was always a code for a name, and like all codes based on linguistic transliteration, it could be rendered slightly differently depending on the conventions of the decoder. This is why Irenaeus says some scribes erred following the ordinary mode of speech. They used the name spelling that was ordinary in their linguistic context, which produced a different number. Modern textual critics generally accept 66 as the original number for several reasons. First, it appears in more manuscripts overall and in manuscripts from diverse geographical locations. Second, Irenaeus, writing very early and claiming connection to apostolic witnesses, treats it as authoritative. Third, there's a general principle in textual criticism that the more difficult reading is, usually original. Scribes tend to simplify or clarify difficult texts, not to complicate them. Since 66 requires the Hebrew spelling Neron, which is less obvious than the Latin Nero, it's more likely that John originally wrote 66 and some scribes corrected it to 616 to match their preferred spelling convention. However, the existence of P115 with 616 complicates this conclusion. P115 is earlier than most manuscripts that contain 666. This suggests that the 616 variant was established early, possibly from the beginning in certain regions. Some scholars now argue that we should not think in terms of one correct reading and one error, but rather recognise that John's original audience may have included people who would calculate the number using different spelling conventions and thus arrive at different results. John may have been aware that some would get 66 and others 616, and both would be right because both pointed to the same answer, Nero Caesar. This ambiguity was not a bug but a feature. The code was robust enough to survive translational variation while still pointing to the same solution. Whatever the textual history, one thing is certain. The existence of the 616 variant proves that the number was always understood to be a code for a name, not a mystical constant. If 66 had been understood from the beginning as a cosmic symbol of evil, independent of any specific encoding, there would have been no reason for 616 to exist. The fact that both numbers circulated, and that ancient interpreters understood they were variant calculations of the same name, demonstrates that the gematria interpretation is not a modern scholarly invention, but reflects ancient understanding. Yet by the time most people encounter Revelation today, this crucial piece of evidence is invisible. Modern Bibles print 66 without explaining the 616 variant or discussing its significance. Modern preachers, unaware of P115 and early textual debates, treat 66 as an unchanging, unambiguous symbol. The very manuscript evidence that would clarify the number's original meaning remains hidden in scholarly footnotes, inaccessible to general readers. This is a recurring pattern in the history of 666. Crucial contextual information that would clarify its meaning is lost, forgotten, or suppressed, while the number itself persists and accumulates new layers of interpretation, increasingly distant from its original purpose. For the first 3 centuries after John wrote Revelation, the text existed in a state of precarious survival. Christianity was an illegal religion, periodically persecuted by Roman authorities with varying degrees of intensity and systematic thoroughness. Christian texts were confiscated and burned as subversive literature. Possessing them could mean imprisonment, torture, or death. The persecution varied dramatically across time and place. Some emperors actively sought out Christians. Nero blamed them for the fire of Rome and unleashed brutal persecution. Domitian demanded divine worship and punished refusal. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, nevertheless presided over persecutions, including the martyrdom of Justin Martyr and the Christians of Lyon. Decius, in the mid-3rd century, ordered empire-wide sacrifice to the gods and execution of those who refused. Diocletian, at the turn of the 4th century, launched the last and greatest persecution, attempting to eliminate Christianity entirely. But persecution was not constant. Long periods of relative peace intervened, during which Christianity grew and organized itself. Some emperors were indifferent to Christians. Local governors had discretion about whether and how to enforce anti-Christian edicts. In some regions, Christians lived openly for generations without interference. In others, they remained underground, meeting in secret, hiding their texts and their identities. The legal situation was complex. Christianity was technically illegal, a superstitio illicita, an unauthorized religion. Romans were generally tolerant of foreign religions, allowing conquered peoples to worship their native gods, but they required participation in Roman state religion and emperor worship as a sign of civic loyalty. Christians refused both, making them suspect. They were accused of atheism for denying the gods, cannibalism, a misunderstanding of the Eucharist, incest because they called each other brother and sister, and general misanthropy for separating themselves from mainstream society. Despite this, Christianity spread. By the end of the 2nd century, there were significant Christian communities throughout the empire, in Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, Carthage, Lyon, and hundreds of smaller cities and towns. By the end of the 3rd century, despite periodic persecution, Christianity may have included 10% of the empire's population. This growth required texts. Christianity was a religion of the book, or rather of many books: Gospels, letters of apostles, acts of apostles and martyrs, and apocalypses circulated among communities. These texts were copied by hand and passed from church to church. They were read aloud in worship gatherings. They were studied by teachers and students. They shaped Christian identity, theology, and practice. Despite periodic persecution, or perhaps because of it, Revelation circulated widely. It was copied, passed from church to church, carried by travelers, hidden in homes, treasured as a message of hope and resistance. Each copy represented hours or days of painstaking work. Each reading was an assertion that Rome's power was temporary and God's kingdom was eternal. Each circulation was a small act of defiance, but copying by hand is an imperfect process, and ancient manuscripts contain numerous variants, not just in Revelation, but in every text from antiquity. The variants range from trivial, different spellings of the same word, to substantial, entire sentences present in some manuscripts but absent in others. Scribes made mistakes for numerous reasons. They misread letters in dim light. Ancient manuscripts were written in continuous script without spaces between words or punctuation, making errors easy. They skipped lines when their eyes jumped from one instance of a word to another instance nearby, a phenomenon textual critics call parablepsis. They misheard when someone dictated text to them. Some manuscripts were produced by one person reading aloud while several scribes copied simultaneously. They corrected what they thought were errors, standardizing grammar or spelling according to their own conventions. They occasionally added marginal notes or explanatory comments that later scribes incorporated into the text itself, thinking they were part of the original. Professional scribes working in major cities might be highly skilled, trained in careful copying, working in well-equipped scriptoriums with good materials and lighting. But many copies were made by ordinary Christians, presbyters, teachers, or simply literate members of small communities, working with whatever materials they could obtain or afford, often in poor conditions. The materials themselves were challenging. In the early centuries, manuscripts were written on papyrus, made from the pith of the papyrus plant grown in Egypt. Papyrus sheets were glued together edge to edge to form long rolls. To read, you unrolled the scroll from right to left, reading columns of text as you went. Papyrus was relatively inexpensive and readily available, but it was also fragile. It deteriorated quickly in damp conditions, which is why almost all surviving papyrus manuscripts come from Egypt, where the dry climate preserved them. In the more humid regions of the Mediterranean, papyrus manuscripts rarely survived more than a few generations unless constantly copied to new material. By the 4th century, parchment gradually replaced papyrus for important texts. Parchment made from treated animal skins, usually sheep or calves, was more expensive but far more durable. It could withstand humidity and rough handling. Most surviving ancient manuscripts from the later period are on parchment. The format also changed. Early manuscripts were scrolls, but by the 2nd century Christians increasingly used the codex format, pages folded and bound together like a modern book. This was revolutionary. Scrolls were awkward. You had to unroll to find passages, and both hands were needed to hold the scroll open. Codices were convenient. You could flip pages, find passages quickly, write on both sides of each page, and hold the book with one hand while making notes with the other. Christians adopted the codex format earlier and more enthusiastically than other groups, possibly because it made their texts more practical for worship and study. This in itself shaped how Christian texts were transmitted. The physical format influenced how they were read, used, and preserved. The number 66 was particularly vulnerable to copying errors. In Greek, 66 was not written as 3 Arabic numerals, but as 3 letters, Xi Stigma. Each letter required careful formation. Chi, H, looks like an X and was relatively easy to write, though in some hands it could be confused with Waro, R, or other letters. Xi, X, was more complex, often written as 3 horizontal lines connected by a vertical stroke. In different scribal hands it could look quite different, and careless copying could make it resemble other letters. Stigma st was the real problem. This was an archaic letter that had fallen out of use in everyday Greek by the 1st century AD. It was a ligature combining sigma and tau, representing the sound saint. By the time Revelation was being widely copied in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, many Greek speakers no longer used stigma, and might not even recognize it. A scribe unfamiliar with stigma might confuse it with other letters or symbols. This could lead to the number being miscopied entirely, or to scribes writing out the number in words rather than using the numerical form. Some manuscripts have 666 spelled out in Greek words, rather than the 3-letter numerical notation. Beyond simple visual confusion, there was the possibility of intentional alteration. Ancient scribes did not share our modern reverence for preserving the exact wording of texts. They felt free to improve texts they were copying, correcting grammar they considered poor, clarifying phrases they found ambiguous, harmonizing parallel passages to make them consistent, adding explanatory notes, removing what they considered errors. This was not considered dishonest, but responsible stewardship of the text. The goal was to transmit the meaning, not necessarily the precise wording. If a scribe thought a previous copyist had made an error, for instance writing 66 when it should be 616, based on how the scribe transliterated Nero's name, they might correct it. This means that we cannot be entirely certain what John originally wrote. We have manuscripts from centuries after his death. each with slight differences, and we must use the tools of textual criticism to reconstruct what the original probably said. The conclusion that 666 is more likely original than 616 is based on careful analysis of manuscript relationships, geographical distribution, early witnesses like Irenaeus, and principles about how scribal changes typically occur. But there remains some uncertainty. Moreover, as the decades and centuries passed and Christianity spread beyond its Jewish roots, the cultural context that made the code transparent was lost. Fewer Christians knew Hebrew. Gematria became unfamiliar as a practice. The specific history of Nero and Domitian faded from living memory into distant past. The number 66 persisted in the text, but the knowledge needed to decode it was disappearing. By the 3rd century, Christian interpreters were already struggling to identify the beast. They knew it was a code for a name, but which name? They proposed various solutions, as we've seen with Irenaeus' suggestions of Latinos and Titan, but the original obvious answer, Nero Caesar, was becoming obscure. As Christianity transitioned from a persecuted sect to an imperial religion in the 4th century, the interpretation of Revelation underwent a fundamental transformation. The change began in 312 AD when Constantine, one of several competing emperors, won the Battle of the Milvian Bridge and attributed his victory to the Christian god. Constantine legalized Christianity, ended persecution, and began patronizing the church. By the end of the 4th century, under Emperor Theodosius, Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, and pagan worship was suppressed. This created a theological crisis for interpreting Revelation. In John's time, the beast was a coded reference to Rome, the oppressor of Christians. But now Christians were part of Rome. Christian emperors sat on the throne. Christian bishops had influence in imperial courts. The church was receiving state funding, building magnificent cathedrals with imperial support, organizing itself according to Roman administrative divisions. How could the beast represent Rome when Christians were now Romans? How could the empire be condemned when it was now Christian? The original political meaning of Revelation became not just obscure, but actively inconvenient. The solution developed by Christian theologians was to dehistoricize and spiritualize the beast, transforming it from a political symbol into a cosmic one. The beast was no longer a specific emperor or empire that had existed or would exist at a particular historical moment. Instead, it was reinterpreted as Satan, as the Antichrist, as the embodiment of all evil operating throughout all history. This transformation was already beginning before Constantine. We can trace it through the writings of the Church Fathers, the early Christian theologians who shaped Christian doctrine from the 2nd through 5th centuries. Irenaeus of Lyon, writing around 80 AD, was one of the first to speculate systematically about the identity of the beast. As we've seen, he understood that the number was a code for a name and attempted various calculations. But significantly, even though he lived relatively close in time to John and understood the basic method, he did not identify Nero. The specific historical reference was already becoming obscure, just 1 or 2 generations after John wrote. Instead, Irenaeus focused on the future. While he acknowledged that the number might refer to Latinos, the Latin kingdom, or Titan, a mythological rebel, he increasingly emphasized that the beast represented a future Antichrist who would appear at the end of history. This shift from past Nero to future Antichrist would have enormous consequences. Irenaeus wrote, "It is therefore more certain and less hazardous to await the fulfillment of the prophecy than to be making surmises and casting about for any names that may present themselves, inasmuch as many names can be found possessing the number mentioned." This cautious approach suggested that definitive identification was not yet possible because the beast had not yet appeared. This interpretation made Revelation perpetually relevant and perpetually urgent. The Antichrist could appear at any moment, in any generation. Christians must remain vigilant, must watch for the signs, must be ready to resist when he appeared. But it also made Revelation perpetually frustrating. The definitive fulfillment was always just ahead, never quite arriving. Hippolytus of Rome, writing around 200 AD, developed the Antichrist interpretation more fully. He wrote extensive commentaries on Daniel and Revelation, attempting to create a comprehensive eschatological timeline. He argued that the beast represented not just a person, but a kingdom, specifically a future revival of the Roman Empire that would arise to persecute Christians before Christ's return. Hippolytus connected Revelation to the vision in Daniel 7, which described 4 beasts representing 4 kingdoms. Traditional Jewish interpretation identified these as Babylon, Media, Persia, and Greece. Hippolytus reinterpreted them as Babylon, Media, Persia, Greece, and Rome, but he argued that Rome would fall, then be revived in the future as a 10-kingdom confederacy, represented by the beast's 10 horns, from which the Antichrist would arise. This created a template that would be used for the next 2,000 years. Revelation describes not current or recent events, but future events. The beast is not a past emperor, but a future tyrant. The persecution is not what we are experiencing now, but what will come later. The end is always imminent, but never quite here. Hippolytus also pioneered calculation of the date of the end. He believed Christ would return 6,000 years after creation, based on an interpretation of Psalm 94, 1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has just gone by, combined with the 6 days of creation. Since he calculated that creation occurred around 500 BC, he expected Christ to return around 500 AD. When that date passed without incident, later interpreters would simply recalculate using different assumptions, but the method, using biblical numbers to predict the date, persisted. Tertullian, writing in North Africa around the same time as Hippolytus, identified the beast with the Roman state and argued that the restrainer mentioned in 2 Thessalonians 2, who holds back the Antichrist, was the Roman Empire itself. As long as Rome stood, the Antichrist could not appear. This created an ironic situation. Christians who believed Rome was the beast also believed Rome's existence prevented something worse, the Antichrist, from appearing. This gave Christians vested interest in Rome's survival even while expecting its eventual fall. But it was Augustine of Hippo, writing in the early 5th century, who most profoundly reshaped interpretation of Revelation for the Western Church. Augustine was Bishop of Hippo in North Africa during a time of imperial crisis. In 410, Visigoths sacked Rome, the first time in 800 years that the city had fallen to foreign invaders. The shock was enormous. Pagans blamed Christians, arguing that abandoning the old gods had brought divine punishment. Christians struggled to understand how God could permit such disaster to his now Christian empire. Augustine's response was his masterwork, The City of God, written over 13 years. In it, he developed a comprehensive philosophy of history and a new way of reading Revelation. Augustine argued that history is the story of 2 cities, the city of God and the city of man, intermingled in this world, but destined for different ends. The city of God consists of all those who love God and seek eternal truth. The city of man consists of all those who love self and seek temporal power. These 2 cities have existed since Cain killed Abel, coexist throughout history, and will be finally separated at the Last Judgment. Revelation in Augustine's reading is not a timeline of future events, but a symbolic description of this ongoing cosmic struggle. The beast is not a specific future person, but represents the city of man in all its manifestations throughout history, any political power, any human institution, any cultural force that sets itself against God. The 1,000-year reign of Christ described in Revelation 20, the millennium, is not a future earthly kingdom but the present age of the church, from Christ's first coming to his second coming. The first resurrection is not a physical event, but the spiritual resurrection that occurs through baptism when a person dies to sin and rises to new life in Christ. The binding of Satan described in Revelation 20 already occurred through Christ's death and resurrection, though Satan retains limited power within bounds set by God. This amillennial interpretation, so called because it rejects belief in a literal future millennium, became the dominant view in Western Christianity for nearly 1,000 years. It was attractive for multiple reasons. First, it made Christianity compatible with political power. The Church could be allied with Christian emperors without the embarrassment of scriptural texts predicting their destruction. The Roman Empire might be flawed, but it was not the beast, or rather, it was the beast only, insofar as any human institution can manifest the city of man, but it could also serve God's purposes. Second, it discouraged apocalyptic speculation and fanaticism. Augustine had witnessed various apocalyptic movements that predicted Christ's imminent return, leading to social disruption when dates passed without fulfillment. By spiritualizing revelation, Augustine removed it as a tool for date setting and maintained focus on faithful living rather than end times calculation. Third, it preserved revelation's relevance without tying it to specific historical circumstances. Every generation could find itself in the symbolic narrative, facing persecution, the beast, tempted by wealth, Babylon, called to faithfulness, the witnesses, promised victory, the New Jerusalem. The text remained meaningful without requiring identification of specific contemporary figures as the Antichrist. For Augustine, the number 66 represented imperfection and incompleteness. 7 was the number of perfection and divine completion. 7 days of creation, 7 spirits before God's throne, 7 churches, 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 bowls. 7 represented the work of God brought to completion. 6, falling short of 7 by 1, represented incompleteness, imperfection, the failure to achieve the divine 7. It was the number of humanity created on the 6th day. Humans are made in God's image but are not divine. We approach perfection but never achieve it in this life. We are 6, not 7. 3 sixes, 6 represented complete incompleteness, perfect imperfection, humanity in full rebellion against God, trying to make itself divine but falling eternally short. It was the number of the beast because it demonstrated the beast's essential inadequacy and the futility of all human attempts to replace God. This interpretation was elegant, theologically sophisticated, and completely severed from the original historical meaning. Nero was not mentioned. The specific persecution under Domitian was not considered. The coded resistance to Roman imperialism was spiritualized away. The number 66 became an abstract symbol of human pride and cosmic evil, rather than a political weapon. Augustine's interpretation became authoritative in Western Christianity through the Middle Ages. It was taught in monasteries and universities, repeated in sermons and theological treatises, woven into the intellectual fabric of Christendom. For nearly a millennium, most Western Christians read Revelation through an Augustinian lens. But the Eastern Church, centered in Constantinople, never fully embraced this reading. Eastern Christians were more suspicious of Revelation altogether. The book's canonical status remained contested in the East long after it was settled in the West. Some Eastern Church Fathers rejected it entirely. When it was accepted, it was usually read more literally and historically than Augustine's allegorical approach allowed. This East-West divide in interpretation would persist, though both traditions moved increasingly far from John's original meaning. The code was thoroughly lost. The number 66, which had begun as a clever way to identify Nero without endangering Christians, had become a floating symbol that could mean almost anything. Human imperfection, cosmic evil, political tyranny, spiritual rebellion, or whatever interpreter wanted it to mean. And with each new layer of interpretation, with each theological sophistication added, the original simple answer, Nero Caesar, calculated through Hebrew gematria, receded further into obscurity, buried under centuries of accumulated tradition, inaccessible even to scholars, until modern methods of historical criticism would eventually dig it out again. From the 10th through the 15th centuries, as medieval European society took shape under the cultural dominance of Christianity, the number 66 moved from theological texts into popular consciousness, into art and architecture, into sermons and legends, and into the collective imagination of a deeply religious society living in constant awareness of cosmic spiritual warfare. This was the age of Christendom, the period when Christianity wasn't merely a religion, but the organizing principle of civilization itself. Church and state were intertwined, secular and sacred inseparable. The church wasn't an institution within society, but the framework of society itself. Everyone was born Christian, everyone was baptized, everyone participated in the ritual life of the church. To be outside the church was to be outside civilization, literally excommunicated from human community. In this world, spiritual realities were immediate and concrete. Heaven and hell were not metaphors but destinations, as real as Rome or Paris. Angels and demons were not symbolic but actual beings, constantly present and active. Saints interceded for the living. The dead in purgatory awaited prayers. Miracles happened regularly, authenticated by church authorities and witnessed by credible sources. The boundary between natural and supernatural was permeable, constantly crossed. Revelation, and particularly the number 66, took on new power in this context. The apocalypse was not distant future but ever-present possibility. Every disaster, plague, famine, war, earthquake, was interpreted through apocalyptic lens. Were these the birth pangs of the end times? Was the Antichrist about to appear? Would Christ return in this generation? Medieval Christians lived with an intense apocalyptic consciousness that is difficult for modern people to fully comprehend. The year 1000 AD approached with widespread expectation that the millennium prophesied in Revelation 20 would end and Christ would return. When the year passed without apocalypse, some theologians recalculated, suggesting the millennium began not with Christ's birth, but with his death or resurrection, pushing the end date to 1033 or thereabouts. When that date also passed, new calculations were made, but the apocalyptic expectation never fully dissipated. This period saw the full flowering of Christian apocalypticism in art, literature, and popular culture. Revelation's imagery dominated medieval religious art. Cathedral sculptures depicted the Last Judgment, with Christ enthroned in glory, angels separating the saved from the damned, the righteous ascending to paradise while the wicked were dragged to hell by demons. Stained glass windows illustrated scenes from Revelation. The four horsemen, the woman clothed with the sun, the beast rising from the sea, the dragon cast down, the New Jerusalem descending. The beast with 7 heads appeared in countless manuscript illuminations. Artists depicted it with meticulous detail, combining features from Daniel's visions, leopard, bear, lion, with the additional horns and heads described in Revelation. The imagery was terrifying, deliberately so. It was meant to inspire fear of sin and evil, to visualize the cosmic struggle between good and evil, to make abstract theology concrete and emotionally powerful. And the number 66 appeared, sometimes hidden in decorative elements, sometimes prominently displayed as a warning. In some cathedrals, the number was incorporated into the architecture itself, not accidentally but deliberately, as part of complex theological programs that transformed buildings into books teaching Christian doctrine through stone and glass. Preachers used Revelation, and especially the number 66, as tools of moral instruction and social control. The beast was identified with various enemies and threats. Muslims who controlled the Holy Land and had conquered much of the Mediterranean were frequently identified as servants of the beast, particularly after the First Crusade in 1096. Jews who refused to convert to Christianity and who were blamed for Christ's death were sometimes accused of bearing the mark of the beast. Heretics, Christians who deviated from orthodox doctrine, were definitely agents of the beast, possibly the Antichrist himself. The mark of the beast was interpreted as anything signifying allegiance to ungodly powers. This could include participation in non-Christian rituals, but it expanded to include various commercial and cultural practices that seemed threatening or foreign. Some preachers warned against certain trade practices as bearing the mark. Others identified specific styles of dress, forms of entertainment or cultural innovations as signs of the beast's influence. This was not mere metaphor. People who were identified as bearing the mark could face serious consequences: social ostracism, loss of property, imprisonment, even execution. The accusation of being marked by the beast was weaponized, used to destroy enemies and enforce conformity. One particularly striking example involves the Black Death, the bubonic plague that swept through Europe from 1347 to 1353, killing perhaps 1/3 of the continent's population. The scale of death was incomprehensible. Entire towns were depopulated. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. Social order collapsed in many regions. It seemed like the apocalypse itself. Some preachers noted that if you calculated carefully, 1348 was approximately 66 years after some significant date in Christ's ministry. The exact calculation varied depending on which date you chose as starting point and how you measured years. This was taken as proof that the plague was the work of the beast, a sign of the approaching end. This kind of calculation was not rigorous mathematics or careful theology. It was apocalyptic numerology, the desperate human attempt to find pattern and meaning in catastrophic suffering. But it was powerful. It shaped how people understood their world and their place in it. If the plague was God's judgment mediated through the beast, then the proper response was repentance, prayer, and purification of society from sin. Unfortunately, purification often meant scapegoating. Jews were accused of causing the plague by poisoning wells. Despite the fact that Jews died from plague at the same rates as Christians, despite papal pronouncements that the accusations were false, pogroms erupted across Europe. Entire Jewish communities were murdered. The number 66 and the imagery of the beast provided theological justification for atrocity. This reveals a dark pattern in the history of 666. The number serves to dehumanize enemies by marking them as not merely wrong or threatening, but cosmically evil, agents of ultimate wickedness, servants of the beast. Once someone or some group is identified with 666, ordinary moral constraints on how they can be treated dissolve. Violence against them becomes not merely permissible, but righteous, a form of spiritual warfare. The medieval church was deeply ambivalent about Revelation itself. The book had always been controversial. Unlike the Gospels or the letters of Paul, Revelation was not universally accepted into the biblical canon in the early centuries. The process of canonization, determining which books were authoritative scripture and which were not, took centuries and was contentious. The Eastern Orthodox Church was particularly skeptical of Revelation. Some branches of Eastern Christianity did not include it in their biblical canon at all, and even where it was accepted, it was not used liturgically. To this day, Revelation is the only New Testament book not read in Eastern Orthodox worship services. This skepticism stemmed partly from theological concerns. The book's imagery seemed too violent, too materialistic, too focused on earthly judgment rather than spiritual transcendence, and partly from practical concerns about apocalyptic movements that used Revelation to justify rebellion and social disorder. The Western Church did include Revelation in its canon, but with reservations. Church councils debated its meaning and how it should be interpreted. Augustine's allegorical interpretation was officially favoured, but it competed with more literal readings that continually surfaced in popular movements. These literal readings were often associated with social unrest. Apocalyptic movements arose repeatedly throughout the Middle Ages, led by charismatic preachers who claimed to have decoded revelations, prophecies, and who declared that the end was imminent. These movements sometimes attracted large followings, particularly among the poor and dispossessed, who hoped for divine intervention to overturn an unjust social order. Church authorities usually suppressed these movements, viewing them as threats to social order and ecclesiastical authority. Apocalyptic preachers who challenged the Church's interpretation of Revelation, or who identified church officials as agents of the beast, could be arrested, tried for heresy, and executed. Yet the movements kept emerging century after century, each one claiming to have finally understood Revelation's true meaning, each one finding 6 in contemporary enemies, each one warning that the end was at hand. The pattern would repeat endlessly: apocalyptic expectation, calculation of the number, identification of the beast, failed prediction, recalculation, renewed expectation. Meanwhile, in the monasteries where manuscripts were copied and preserved, scribes continued to handle the number 66 with fear and reverence. Monastic culture was saturated with awareness of spiritual warfare. Monks saw themselves as spiritual athletes, engaged in constant battle against demons who sought to tempt, deceive, and destroy them. Prayer, fasting, vigilance, and obedience to monastic rule were weapons in this warfare. The act of copying scripture was itself a spiritual discipline, a form of prayer and a meditation. But it was also potentially dangerous. Scribes were handling powerful words, divine names, sacred symbols. If done carelessly or irreverently, the work could invite spiritual attack. The number 66 was treated with particular caution. As mentioned earlier, some scriptoriums developed specific protocols: fasting before beginning the section, prayers for protection, rapid writing without dwelling on the number, crosses or invocations written in the margin. Some manuscripts omit folio 666 entirely, skipping from 665 to 67 in page numbering. This was not merely superstition in the modern sense, irrational fear based on ignorance. In the medieval worldview, symbols had ontological reality and causal power. Names and numbers were not arbitrary signs, but participated in what they signified. To speak God's name was to invoke his presence. This was the theological basis for liturgical prayer and sacramental theology. By parallel reasoning, to write the number of the beast was to risk invoking the beast's presence or influence. Medieval monks lived in a world where demons were understood to be real, active, and dangerous. Temptation was not psychological, but demonic. Actual evil spirits whispering in the mind, appearing in visions, physically assaulting monks in their cells. Stories of demonic attacks on monks were common in monastic literature. Writing the number 66 without proper spiritual preparation could invite such an attack. This belief shaped how the text was transmitted. The fear surrounding 66 was itself copied along with the number, passed from generation to generation through marginal notes, scribal protocols, and oral traditions. Each new scribe inherited not just the texts, but the accumulated anxiety of centuries of previous copyists. Yet despite all these challenges, theological controversy, apocalyptic speculation, social upheaval, scribal fear, revelation survived, and with it the number 666. By the end of the Middle Ages, as Europe approached the tremendous transformations of the Renaissance and Reformation, the number was deeply embedded in Christian consciousness. It had travelled far from John's original meaning, accumulating layers of interpretation that both enriched and obscured it. The code was long forgotten, but the symbol's power had only grown, and it was about to be weaponized in new and devastating ways.